from the political science department, and they're going to speak and give a spectrum of all. They represent a spectrum of, I would say, activity in Israel in general, but of our activity of things that we're doing from Bar-Ilan University in the current situation. I'd like to share with you for a couple of moments, for a couple of minutes, a little bit about what happens in a university when you have a situation as such. How do you handle it? What do you do? And I'll just give you a little bit of an insight, short insight to what we did in Bar-Ilan University. And it's only going to be touching on very, very minor things. So on the evening of 7th of October, once everybody knew what was happening, still on 7th of October, the university management had a meeting of all the senior management, 40 people. And this was our first meeting and the immediate crisis response meeting. And we've been meeting since then twice or three times a week to handle everything that comes up. And the immediate action obviously was needed. And, for example, things like immediate delay in work to secure the campus. We had cyber attacks, which we still have. The international students who didn't know exactly what was going on. We had to delay the studies. And it goes on, all kind of things that needed immediate care. And as we moved on, there were more things to take care of. And the second thing that we quickly did was to care for our own. We immediately generated a committee to handle our victims. And when I say our victims, we've had 5 students who were killed on the first day, 4 who were seriously injured. We have faculty members who lost their children, their nephews. We have faculty members who their close family members were abducted to Gaza. This all, from our perspective as the management of the university, required us to generate a committee which would handle this, which would help each of these people get through this crisis so that we would be part of the system that helps them. Obviously, we're doing it till today. And the second thing that we did was something which is very part of the DNA of Bar-Ilan University. We strongly, strongly believe in giving to society and volunteering. And we immediately asked ourselves, already from the first evening, but from there on, we started immediately moving into what can we do, not only for the university, but also for society. And we generated a whole collection of services for society. And I just mentioned maybe one or two. One thing that we generated on the first night, was a mental support, a mental health support line. And we thought that we would do this for our own. And then we quickly saw that we had close to 130 people from within our university who were willing to service on the hotline and were equipped to do so. And we opened it up for the general public, and we've already answered given service to more than 1,000 people. And this was one service which is still running. And we actually ran a campaign for something that we saw the medical school came up with, the need for portable ultrasounds for people who are in Gaza. And we did a campaign, and we raised close to $1 million and bought hundreds of portable ultrasounds. We're doing I can go on and on with all kinds of things that we're doing for the public, and some of them, they're very, very, they vary greatly, and a lot of it is supported by the faculty members and their specialties, because they know a tremendous amount of, each one brings his own wealth of knowledge. And I think that what we're going to hear today gives a perspective of that, because we have 4 different faculty members from 4 different disciplines, and each of them is working very hard in the situation, in the current situation, each one with a different perspective, and you'll have a chance to hear each one of them shortly. So I hope you take away from this evening some insights of what's happening here, and that you'll benefit from it. So have a good evening.
Thank you. Sorry, I would now like to invite Dr. Alon Barash, an expert in human anatomy from the Azrieli Faculty of Medicine. Dr. Barash will speak of his own experience in missing in action identification.
Hi, everyone. So I'll tell you a bit about myself because it's all part of what we're doing here. My name is Alon. I'm a physical anthropologist by training, and I teach anatomy in the Faculty of Medicine in Tzfat, the Azrieli Faculty of Medicine. I've been here since the opening of the faculty about 12 years ago, and I'm actually now speaking to you from my secure space, sort of a bunker that each Israeli has in their own homes, just in case there will be sirens and you'll see my family rushing in. We live like 10 kilometers from the Lebanese border. We're still here, but we're always on alert for sirens. As I said, I'm a physical anthropologist and I teach anatomy, and never in my life have I expected that I would use this knowledge in this scenario. I work on Neanderthals. I study human bones. I study the human anatomy and teach it to medical students, to physical therapy students, and I've been doing so for the last 25 years. On October 7th, Saturday morning, I woke up around 6:30 a.m. by the sound of airplanes above my kibbutz. I immediately realized that something is going on. I turned on my phone and saw a whole lot of messages from my Army Reserve unit saying that I should get ready. From the 7th of October, actually, from the noon 7th of October, I'm part of the Israeli Reserve Army. I'm the only physical anthropologist who is working in the army right now. And my job is to look for missing person, civilians and both civilians and soldiers. It's been a rough 5 weeks, and I'm sorry if I'll get emotional. I have to apologize for that. It's been quite stressful times. As I said, as the only physical anthropologist on Reserve Army, and it took a lot of effort to switch from working on human bones. This is what I do. I work on human bones of people who died thousands and tens of thousands of years ago, looking into people who died a few days ago. It should be the same. Bones are bones, but it's not. I can tell you a lot of stories on the things I went through, but I'll try to keep it not so graphic. I work on the worst cases. Meaning worst cases is that there is no DNA remains. There is no way to extract DNA. Some of it because the bodies were burned so badly in so high temperatures that there is nothing left, nothing but the bones. And we had to sort of go back to the old biological anthropology, working from the bones and realizing who these people are. And it's very, very difficult. Just one small example of even the emotional stress is that I was looking through a bunch of burns from a burned scenario somewhere, and I found a hairpin of a girl, and that girl didn't expect her life to end like that. She woke up in the morning, she put her hairpins, and she died. And as I said, even though I'm used to looking at bones, this is completely something else. I began my sort of work at the National Institute for Forensic Medicine in Israel, where the bodies came in of civilians, and we tried very hard to identify them, mostly through dental records. Not all of them had these dental records, and it was really just gluing pieces of bones together to see what we can understand about these people. Had they broken any bones? Did they have any special variants in their skeleton that I can identify and look for? Am I looking at a male or a female, adult or juvenile, young, child? It's in some cases I had 10 people in the same room that I had to separate them into different skeletons. This took a lot of time. This Sunday was my last identification process. We identified several soldiers, again through a lot of experience, my experience, and a lot of even I would say a forensic investigation, which is not what I do usually, but just to think as an academic and understanding what are we looking for, who are we looking for, and getting to know these people even intimately, reading their medical records to see if they broken bones, what kind of medical treatments they had. One of the soldiers I worked on had her wisdom tooth pulled up a couple of months before she died, and I could see it in the bones. I found the jaw, and I saw the marks of the wisdom tooth being pulled out, and I knew it was her. And as I said, never in my life have I thought that this is something I would do as an academic. There's like 3 or 4 of us in Israel, physical anthropologists or biological anthropologists, and most of them said that they couldn't do it. Just emotionally, they couldn't do it, and I fully understand. And as I said, I'm the only one who is doing it right now. Part of that process right now, what I'm doing is writing all the medical reports, trying to figure out how we go on, how we're going to deal with new cases. Hopefully there won't be any new cases, but we have to look forward and think about that. And I find myself as a researcher trying to figure out what's the best way to identify missing people. And again, those who we can't even have a DNA result. There is nothing left. Above 500 degrees Celsius of fire, there is nothing left. Some of the bones I worked on burned so badly, there is no organic material. You touch the bones, and it's just pure calcium. There is nothing left. So that's something, as I said, as an academic, that I have to look into and think about it. And it always bothers me. Should I write a research paper about these things? I feel on one hand, this is something that we should write about it. This will help other people, not just in terror attacks, but also mass disasters. But on the other hand, I feel like I'm working on something that is so personal and so intimate that I cannot share this with the world. I don't know what I'm going to do about this. It's very, very. I'm not there yet in a sense of writing the research paper about it. And on the same page, I don't even know how can I return to teach medical students like nothing happened. I teach anatomy. We do dissection on human cadavers. I've seen enough, and I have no idea how I'm going to go back to teaching anatomy, which I've been doing for the last 25 years. And this is something that whoever I talk to, friends of mine at the Forensic Institute, friends of mine in other anatomy departments, we all share the same thoughts, that we have no idea how we're going to go back to our normal life. And this is something that we'll have to deal with in hopefully in the near future, but we don't really know when we will be back to our regular old positions. We're all strong here. We are all very minded to what we are doing. But this is a rough time here in Israel, and I think this is something we all share, whether we are involved in the army, in the civilian activities, or whether we just sit back and watch TV. And that's one of my personal thoughts, that I really suffer for what I do. It takes a toll, but I would rather do this than sit back and do nothing, especially with the knowledge that I have. That's the tip of my story, and thank you for hearing it.
Dr. Barash, maybe I should show the movie and you will make a reference about it.
Yes.
So this is a movie from the National Center of Forensic Medicine.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure that we can hear.
Yael,
On the share screen
I'll try
field,
to
you have
share
to
it
click
again.
the audio.
I'll try to share it again. Just a second.
אנחנו מדברים על כמות אדירה, עצומה של קורבנות. ב-28 שנה שאני נמצא במכון, אני לא זוכר נזק כל כך סטני.
לא הייתה הסתפקות רק בלהרוג, אלא בלהוציא את צלם האנוש מהבן אדם.
תינוקות, ילדים קטנים, בני 5, 6, 10, נערים, נערות.
שנשרפו עד כלות. אבא, כרות רגליים. עם 3 ילדים ואישה שרופים.
המוח לא תופס את זה.
ערימת איברים שהוצאה מכאן ומכאן, והועלתה באש.
זה לא דומה לשום דבר.
יש לנו מקרים בלי ראשים או בלי רגליים, שכמעט זה בלתי אפשרי לזהות אם אנחנו נמצאים מול ילד, מול תינוק.
רבים המקרים שלא יכלו המשפחות לזהות את יקיריהם.
אני לא מצליח להבין איך העולם כולו לא מבין מה הגודל האכזריות שיש במקרה הזה.
So let me just add that Dr. Ricardo we work together in the Forensic Institute, and this is a veteran who's seen everything, and he, like all of us, broke down at one point. And as I said, I'm proud of what I'm doing, but it takes its toll. It definitely takes its toll, and as I said, I'm proud to be part of the team that identified some of those 200 men and women and children and babies, and I hope it's the last time I do that. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Barash. I would now like to invite Professor Sarah Friedman head of the Weisfeld Family School of Social Work from the Faculty of Social Sciences. Professor Friedman will speak about the war and the trauma of war. Where are we and where do we need to go?
Thank you. And thank you, Alon. It's a little bit difficult, I think, for all of us to carry on after that. So, as Netta said, my name is Sarah Friedman. I'm the head of the School of Social Work. I'm also on the National Council for Post-Trauma. My research and my clinical work has always been in trauma. And I'm also the mother and wife of 2 combat soldiers. And it's important because to mention that, I don't usually mention personal things when I'm talking about what I do at work, but it's very important in this time to understand how everything is very enmeshed from everybody here. I'm going to share with you. I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint. And what I'd like to do, my computer will help, is talk to you a little bit about what we know about the psychological effects of war, what's so different about this situation, and what we have been doing and think maybe will be helpful. If you think of the word war and you think about what picture pops into your mind, I think after hearing Alon and the pictures we just saw are probably the things that you're seeing. But for some of us, you know, especially before October the 7th, then maybe the pictures that pop in are what you learned as a history lesson. Maybe you personally have some experience, but quite possibly not. And possibly what you actually think about when you think about war is what you know from films and, you know, movies and books that you've read, and that's where you come from. I'm going to come back to the images because they're important later on. We know that most of us, according to some research, more than 90% of us will experience what's called a traumatic event during our life, anything from a car crash to an assault to a robbery. But interestingly, most of us actually are okay after that. And when we're talking about what's known as post-traumatic stress disorder, you see that over the lifetime prevalence of just under 7%. And to put it on a slightly different perspective, if you look at people about 4 months after they've gone through a car crash, quite minor car crashes, then you see about 17% of them will get PTSD. And that depends also on the event. So, you know, terror attacks, you're going to get about 35% of PTSD. PTSD isn't the only thing that you see after a traumatic event, but it is quite important. When you're talking about combat, then it's a little bit higher, not a lot, but it's a little bit higher. And for both of these, whether it's civilian or military, then it's always the numbers are higher for women. This is partly because women suffer from more sexual assault, which comes with more higher rates of PTSD, but not just. What is post-traumatic stress disorder? Well, as I said, back to the pictures, it's primarily or hallmark is that you have images that come back again and again and again and again, re-experiencing what it is. It's in some ways a problem of memory, that when we think about something that's happened in the past, then it's in the past and we know it's in the past. But with PTSD, then we get a bit confused about whether it's happened and it's finished or it's still going on, and then it comes back again and again in the same way. We also see people with a lot of avoidance. It's very, very scary to feel these things, and people do everything they can not to talk about it, not to think about it, not to go near anything that might remind them. We've seen people in the past who've gone years and not mentioned what it is that they ever went through. The avoidance is much worse than other anxiety disorders, because it's not just, you know, if you've got a phobia of a dog, then you might not go to the park. But if you've got PTSD, you pretty much don't feel safe anywhere. I've had people sit in my office for therapy and not be able to sit with their back to the door because they don't feel safe. And they also have something that is called hyperarousal. People are waiting for the next bad thing to happen. They're always on alert. Now, if you walk around Israel at the moment, you'll see that everybody has this to a certain extent. You just hear a motorcycle start and everybody jumps. And as Alon said, you're waiting. Is that the siren? Do I need to run into my safe room, or is it just a normal event? But what you find with people who develop post-traumatic stress disorder is that any noise that's unexpected, a bit like your children playing in the background, and then you jump as if that thing has happened again. People tend to find it very hard to sleep, to concentrate, and they're very irritable. They're very angry. And it's not just fear. They also have anger and shame and guilt and sadness and many, many other difficult emotions. And it comes with many other things. PTSD, 50% of people with PTSD have clinical depression ongoing. Then they tend to find that it's hard to keep going in their families. And so families break down. The same thing at work, work relations break down. Substance disorders, because people try to help themselves by using self-medicating. And you see a great increase in chronic medical conditions and also in suicidality. So even before, when you're not talking about a war situation, it's a public health necessity to help people with PTSD because it has such an impact on society. And what happens with clinical populations during war? Well, the first thing is that when we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, we usually talk about some sort of time thing. The hint is in the name about post-trauma. It means the trauma's finished, and then you have some sort of process that goes on after that. And you see different reactions in the hours and then the days and then the weeks and the months following the event. But with war, then that's a completely different situation. What you find is that the event happens in different ways again and again and again, all the way along. It's not post-trauma, we're still within it. And that's true at the moment here in Israel, very, very clearly. So Netta at the beginning said about the events of October the 7th, and for some people that was the event, but it's not the only event. Nobody just has one event. It's every day something else and something else. And just to give you just one small example, I have a colleague who is also in doing reserve duty, like Alon, and she was coming back from a base today and said to the person who was driving her car, "Oh, maybe that's a siren." And before they got a chance to even think about it, then a rocket had landed on the vehicle in front of them. Miraculously, nobody was hurt. But this is, instead of this being the event, and it would be a big enough event, this is just another event which is ongoing. So it's slightly different when it's civilians. And we know that this is some data that's just come from the Ukraine, where they found 40% of people were suffering from different types of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is obviously very high. We know that children also suffer greatly. The numbers are a little harder to see, partly because with children, you don't always just see PTSD. You might see developmental delay and lots of other issues. And sometimes it takes a while before you see those issues. But children are very vulnerable to the effects of war. And one of the other things that they found in this study in the Ukraine is what we call the dose response, which we always see, which is the more or the worse the trauma is, then the more PTSD. But here they looked at, the number of war stressors, and they added them up, and they said, okay, is anyone who had more than 9 is more likely to get PTSD. Now, I'm not going to show you the whole 30 plus list that they had, but I just went through a few and I got to 8 without even trying. And I suspect that there isn't anybody in Israel who isn't at some point got, at least in terms of their experience, somewhere between 10 to maybe even 15. To give you an example of this, I just want to show you something very quickly. I hope that the sound works, but it's got subtitles. Video.
There's no sound.
Okay, so you didn't get to hear that, but I think you can read it. And it explains one of the things that we're concerned about here, about what's going on at the moment, because one of the things that you'll hear from anybody who has experience working with post-traumatic stress disorder is that this is unprecedented. I think that was quite obvious from what Alon said, but you know, even as trauma experts, where we're used to dealing with people under these circumstances, the situation is unprecedented. And there are a number of reasons for that. Firstly is what we just saw. It's the exposure of the whole population, everybody. There isn't anybody who hasn't been impacted by this. We have many, many people, 130,000 or so, who are misplaced, who have left their homes, which means that, let's put this very clearly, they either don't have a home at the moment, or they certainly are not living in a home. They're living, for example, in a hotel, which means that their children aren't in school in the way that they should be. They may have left their business and they don't have work. This has many, many implications about their ability to cope and to do things. The issue of the military here is very important also because I'm not unusual that I have two family members in combat positions. Everybody does. Everybody has somebody, everybody. And that makes everything that happens much, much harder to cope with. It's much closer. And we have a concept as therapists called shared traumatic reality, which is that when we treat people, then, you know, we tend to have a different space to the person that we're treating, but not in Israel in time of war. It's the same. It's a shared traumatic reality that in the same way that people are dealing with rocket attacks and people missing and everything else, so are all the therapists. The other thing is that we think it's very, very likely to have a very big impact on what we're going to see is the level of the atrocities. And I think that I don't have to add to what we just saw and what Alon described. But we know that these things have a great impact on the types of psychiatric issues that we're going to see. It's much, much harder to come back from these types of events. There's also something about intergenerational trauma, which I think for many people after the what happened specifically on October the 7th have brought back either their own experiences during the Holocaust or their families' experiences. There are many things that are very similar for many people, and that has another impact. And there's also issues of trust. It's very difficult for people to believe, again, that they are going to be safe. It's very hard in this situation. So I'm going to actually give some reasons, however, of where we see, given all of that, some reasons for optimism and where we're going from here. We talk a lot when we talk to people about how to cope during a war situation, that they need to reestablish their routine, even if that routine changes every day, which it might well do, because you might sit down to eat at 8 o'clock one night and the following night at 8 o'clock there's a siren, so you can't sit down and eat and you have to change. But within that, there's a routine. One of the things that happened here very, very quickly was getting as many children back into an educational framework as possible. It's very helpful. It's important somehow, even after days of working or dealing with these things, to try and relax. And one of the things that has been very helpful, I think, for everybody, this will be very obvious to any Israelis, it's a satire news program, but it's something that has made a very big difference to people's morale, the ability to maybe for a few seconds just be able to smile about something or see it in a different perspective. And the other thing that people are very clear about here is about control. There are many things over which we have no control, but there have been very clear messages from every possible agency about not exposing, especially children, to very difficult images. Within hours of the events, October the 7th, there were messages to tell children to take down their social media apps. And this is very important because we know it increases the chances, and it's important. The other thing that is amazing is the concept of community. Now, Moshe talked about this a bit at the beginning, and I'm going to say a few more words, but I just did a quick search on Google about people who are volunteering, and the number of pictures that come out, it's just one after the other after the other. And the numbers of people who are helping in some way, in doing everything from taking washing machines to soldiers so they can have some clean underwear, to cooking some meals, to everything, is that almost 1 in 2 people are doing some sort of volunteer work. Now, if you think about the numbers who are actually in reserves, and so they're not doing this, and the others who maybe have jobs that or child caring, whatever that stop them doing, the numbers are incredible. So, as Moshe said, that we've been doing lots of things within Bar Ilan, within the community, and I think it's a very important thing to talk about. One of the things that we also did was every student, 20,000 of them, got a phone call from a member of faculty, which was incredible. People wrote on Facebook about this. You know, somebody phoned me. I think it was the dean. I think that's what he said. But it's very important because it creates something that people really, really, really appreciate. There's been incredible amounts of outreach, people going and trying to help in any way they possibly can. Other things that we've done, and I'm not going to manage to do go through everything, is that which is one of the things is a collaboration between the medical school and social work and psychology, which is to set up a teddy bear hospital where you can come along as a kid and bring your teddy bear and get some advice on how to cope with everything. And that has been incredibly successful. Somebody in my department took her 2 little kids and said 2 days later there was a siren went off in kindergarten, and she very proudly said, "I know how to help everybody and I know what to do with my teddy bear." Very important. Along with another colleague in our department, Dr. El Shaval Zuckerman, we have built a treatment protocol for trying to help during the war. We've trained more than 200 mental health professionals within the army and met about 5 hospitals. Obviously, for civilian populations, we're both doing ongoing supervision for that. Because again, this is everything we ever knew about what to do after a traumatic event has been thrown out the window, and we've literally had to start writing the books again. Everybody in my department is doing some sort of outreach, supervision, something else. We've also twinned with a local council to help them with the things that they need and provide them with students and staff as part of the faculty who can help. And as I said, myself and also Yael are on the National Council for PTSD. And so one of the things we're trying to do there is actually come up with some recommendations for what we need to be doing now and for the day after, as Alon said, when this is somehow finished. So on the one hand, we have lots of resilience because people are amazing. They are actually able to do this. And on the other hand, we're trying to work out how to help rebuild communities, make sure that families get the help they want and appropriate therapy for anybody who needs. It's going to be a long, long road, but it's incredible to see how much people have pulled together. And I think that's something that's very important. I want to finish with my picture of the war, which is actually obviously not from this war, but from the Second World War, which I think is a picture of resilience, a little boy with his flag, showing that even in all the rubble, you can see something about maybe the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Friedman. I would now like to invite Professor Ruth Halperin-Kadari, Founding Director of the Rachman Center for the Advancement of Status of Women at the Law Faculty. Professor Halperin-Kadari will speak about the betrayal of the global human rights community.
Thank you very much, Neta. And thank you all for coming here, for participating in the in the webinar. Just sorry, I tried to share my screen and now okay. Hold on for a second. Can you see can you see the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, Ruti, but not very good. We see like the slides in very like small scale. Please,
Yeah, okay. I'll try to do that again. Sorry. Now it's okay, right?
yeah, now it's good.
Okay. So sorry about that. I would also like to start with some personal background. I too have two sons who are now reservists. One is in combat on the border of Gaza, and he actually came back here to Israel 2 days after the war started, interrupted his graduate studies in Copenhagen. He could not stay there. All his friends from his unit came from all over the world, and the extent of the reservists, I think that the formal figures are about 130% of people showing up for service. But it is extremely difficult. It's very, very stressful to worry both about your personal loved ones and to worry about the whole situation. And the area which I come from is the area of dealing with the sexual violence against women during the October 7th massacre. And I want to talk to you about my own experience in these, what is it now, 40 days since October 7th, when our whole life has really changed forever. And I think that by now, after hearing both Alon and Sarah, it is pretty clear to everybody who listened that nothing will ever be the same again for any of us. Just a short background about the use of women's bodies as a weapon of war. We know that this has been practice of armed conflicts, of wars, maybe we could even say from time immemorial. And that is why on October 7th, when nothing was really clear, but the following day, when the extent of the catastrophe and the horrific events that took place started being more and more clarified, I knew right away that there is no doubt that major parts of the attack took the shape of sexual violence against women, and perhaps not only against women, but also against men and against children. I could not have imagined in my worst nightmares the extent, the scope, the level of the cruelty, of the brutality, of the savagery. I think, again, you heard from Alon, but when we take it to the area of the sexual violence, it's the level of the cruelty is comparable to what Alon just described. And I want to stress that the use of women's bodies as a weapon of war is something that is intended, it is intentional, it is purposefully done. The body of the woman symbolizes the body of the nation. And when the attackers violate women's bodies, it is taken as if they violate the whole nation, the whole body of the whole nation of the enemy. And it symbolizes the ultimate humiliation and the ultimate maybe victory over the enemy. So it is not surprising that we have been seeing these characteristics of terror attacks and of wars. Sarah mentioned Ukraine. Clearly, the war in Ukraine and the Russian invasion into Ukraine carried with it and still carries with it horrible numbers of sexual attacks, and women and children suffer distinctly due to these elements of the wars. And the body of international human rights have been very slow to recognize that even though women hardly have any say in the opening of wars, in declaring wars, they are the most vulnerable, and they are specifically suffer much more and pay the highest price of war, more than men. But notwithstanding this reality, it was only at the turn of the millennium in 2000 that the United Nations and the Security Council actually devoted discussion to this aspect of war and of armed conflicts, and started coming up with specific resolutions that are supposedly addressing the specific vulnerabilities of women as victims of conflict-related sexual violence. And I'll get to that a little later in my presentation. But I'll just mention that with respect to international law, international criminal law, even the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials that followed World War II and the Holocaust did not address sexual violence as a form of war crime. And it was only following the war in Yugoslavia and the war in Rwanda that international criminal law started viewing sexual violence, which is inflicted as part of the war over the enemy, started viewing this as a particular war crime and as crime against humanity. And it's very important to recall this. It took time, but now we are about 4 decades after the recognition of sexual violence during war as a specific war crime and as a crime against humanity. Going back to what happened on October 7th, one of the immediate questions that emerges is what type of evidence for the sexual violence that was part of the attack, of the massacre, what type of evidence do we have? What types can we have? So here I divided it into 3 categories. One is the testimonies, the second is the forensic evidence, and the third is the digital evidence. Testimonies, obviously, people expect victims to tell their stories. Nothing is less realistic than that when we discuss regular sexual violence, more so when we discuss sexual attacks that take place during a terror attack, and tragically, when we look back at the events of October 7th, it is clear that most of the victims who had undergone sexual violence were actually murdered. Some are probably amongst those 239 who are still held hostage in Gaza by the Hamas, by other terrorist groups, 40 days on. And those that did survive the sexual attacks, I know for a fact that there are a number of survivors. They had not stepped forward. They had not come even to seek help or care by the authorities. They are being helped, they are being treated privately by rape crisis centers, organizations that provide such help, by private therapists. If they ever step forward and if they ever are willing to give evidence, it will take long, long time. But then there are eyewitnesses, and just last week, the police did release the testimony, horrifying testimony, of a woman who had seen her friend being raped by one after the other. I'm sorry. Maybe I should have given a warning about this description. It will be short. And she was shot in the head during being raped. There are other indications of other testimonies which had not been released yet. So we expect there to be a few such testimonies. Then there are the testimonies of the first respondents, and this is actually ties together with Alon's presentation at the beginning. The first respondents, the Zaka people who came to collect the bodies, and I'll say a little bit about that in a minute when we talk about the forensic evidence, but they have been already, they gave testimonies to the Central Police, who is investigating. This is the largest criminal investigation ever in Israel's history. And they describe horrific scenes which give states of the bodies that they found, which for which there is no other explanation except for the fact that those who were murdered had been raped before or perhaps after being murdered. Then there are testimonies of caregivers. And what I actually forgot to put here, and I'll put it, you know, we are doing so many things at the same time now, so I apologize that this is not finished work, but I should have also put here testimonies of the terrorists themselves, who are being questions or interrogated by the Shabak now. And some testimonies have already been released, which in which they proudly say that they were specifically ordered to rape and to violate, and there were evidence found in bodies of the terrorists and with and in the belongings of those who were captured alive, written instructions that also give them dispensation from religious prohibitions of raping or of sexually abusing women and children. So there is clear evidence that all this was premeditated and that women and girls and children were specifically targeted to be raped and to be tortured and sexually assaulted and violated. What about forensic evidence? The problems that the Israeli authorities faced on October 7th, 8th, and 9th, and again it ties together with Alon's presentation, is the unimaginable, unprecedented number of bodies that, first of all, had to be identified in order to give concrete information to those families who did not know whether their loved ones are alive, maybe they were captured, or whether they are dead. And as we had seen, there still are dozens who had not been identified yet, who are still missing. And because of the unprecedented number and the first priority to identify, apparently the bodies had not undergone forensic examination or autopsies to find out whether they had undergone sexual assault before they were murdered. So much of the forensic evidence was buried with the bodies. The October 7th massacre was the first ever in history where the crimes were actually documented and filmed in real time by the terrorists in order to be broadcast in real time on social media as part of their plan to torture the family members of the victims and to inflict as much terror as possible over Israeli society. So there were numerous horrific footage of crimes, including sexual crimes, that surfaced over social media on that Saturday. Many of them were actually deleted very soon thereafter. Apparently, when Hamas realized that this is actually doing them disservice instead of reaching their aim of inflicting terror. I want to very quickly just move on to our, and when I say our, I mean women's rights activists, feminist organizations, and human rights activists who are completely shocked and outraged and dismayed by the sheer betrayal of the international human rights community in their lack of condemnation of the horrific massacre, which, as we said immediately after October 7th, we approached numerous human rights treaty bodies in the UN, special mandate holders of the UN, UN Women, UNICEF, you name it. We approached them, we wrote to them, we told the story, and we legally analyzed it. And now I go back to the beginning of my presentation, calling what happened crime, war crime, crime against humanity that reaches genocide because of the purposefulness and the targeting and those written instructions, which we have evidence for, in wanting to eliminate the Jewish people. And none of the UN human rights treaty bodies actually condemned Hamas and called them in their name or called them as committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, not to mention genocide. Here you can see the first statement by the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which was actually the only one to address the Israeli children. But right away you see, we are deeply concerned about the mass killings of dozens of children in the kibbutz Kfar Aza, and about the deaths of so many children in Gaza as of 12 October. And their second statement no longer mentions the children in Israel, only the children in Gaza. And the second sentence here, you see, we also remain deeply concerned about children who continue to be held as hostages. If you are not familiar with what actually happened, you might think that children of Gaza have been taken hostages. No mention of Israel as victim, no mention of Hamas as the perpetrator of the most horrible crime ever. And the CEDAW statement is perhaps the most shameful. No word at all about what happened here on October 7th, what Hamas did, crime against humanity, genocide, nothing. I know that I've reached my time limit. I just want to read things that I said during press conference that took place 2 days ago at the headquarters of the Hostages and Missing Peoples Forum. The silence of the international human rights and women's rights community is deafening. By turning a blind eye to the October 7th massacre and to the unprecedented and premeditated extreme cruelty of the sexual violence committed by Hamas, they not only fail us, but they undermine the purpose for which they were established and in fact undermine the whole international human rights system. Moreover, they are complicit in the campaign of denial launched by Hamas and its allies. They give ammunition to those who dare claim that the October 7th massacre never happened. And the worst, by failing to mention the ongoing war crime of holding hostages, they legitimize disappearance of people and the taking of hostages, not only at present, but possibly encouraging such acts in the future. This is a horrible betrayal by the international human rights community, by women's rights organizations worldwide. And we will not stand still. We will continue to raise awareness. I think that each and every one of you here in this webinar will hopefully be a messenger to send on our message to the world to wake up and to recognize what we have undergone here on October 7th. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Halperin Kadari. I would now like to invite Professor Jonathan Reinhold, Head of the Department of Political Studies from the Faculty of Social Sciences. Professor Reinhold will expand on the geopolitics of the Israel-Gaza war.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you see the presentation?
Yeah.
Okay. I will hopefully have time at the end to relate to the question that Professor Ruth Halperin Kadari has left us with, which is why is it that human rights organizations take the position they do? But before I do that, I want to give you a more traditional geostrategic survey of this conflict. And the first question I want to ask is, why have so many world leaders come to Israel? Why did President Biden, the Prime Minister of Britain, Rishi Sunak, the President of France, at least for a week, the Chancellor of Germany, why did they all say Israel must win? Why did they come? Why did they say Israel must win? It's not only because they're nice people, if indeed they are nice people. It's because what happens here is of global, strategic, political significance. The first reason that it is of great significance is because of the fear of contagion, the fear that what happened in Israel, if it is seen as successful, will serve as a model for those who hold similar ideology throughout the Western world. So if we have a look at the map that I've given you, it tells you, the percentage of Muslims in Western Europe, also Western and Central Europe, Democratic Europe, and in the United States. Okay, now there are about 1.8 billion Muslims in the world, so it's a share of that. Okay, now the survey that I have to hand is one from 2015 of British Muslims, which said that only 4% sympathize with suicide attackers, and a quarter believe that Jews are responsible for most wars in the world. The thing is that when you're talking about probably somewhere close to 4 million Muslims in Britain, 4% is still a hell of a lot of people. And when you then think of it on a much broader scale, it could become a very, very serious problem for lots of countries. And countries fear a demonstration effect that if it's successful in Israel, it will be taken up in other places in different versions, but the idea being that you can just go and terrorize civilians and that this can cause absolute mayhem in their societies and perhaps lead to a real rise in racial and ethnic and religious tensions, which could get extremely violent. So the first thing that has been central to this is the feeling that Israel must win. And as part of that, what President Biden has done, and it's telling that he's done it in coordination with America's main allies in Western Europe, coordinating the visits, the statements, the wordings of the statements, is to say that there is no moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas, and that Hamas is worse than ISIS, and linking it to the Holocaust by saying this is the day in which more Jews have died than on any other day since the Holocaust. Why do that? Because this is not simply about how many guns you've got and how many bombs you've got. It's about legitimizing being able to fight and use force when necessary against the kind of barbarism and evil that Hamas's actions embody. Because if Israel is not allowed to use the force necessary to defeat Hamas, then it sets a precedent that makes it incredibly difficult for Western security forces, be they intelligence organizations or armies, to use the necessary force. And that is why Israel's biggest allies in the Western world tend to be from within the armed forces and within the intelligence services, because they're very alive to this problem. And so if we want to understand why President Biden made this moral thing central, and why he's laying such an emphasis on Israel fighting within the war, the laws of war, the rules of war that make us civilized, he's doing so because in order to maintain the backing for Israel to win, to keep going despite the terrible loss of civilian life in Gaza, he needs to be able to say Israel is different and that the responsibility for this lies with Hamas. And this is why he said in his speech right at the beginning, Israel should supply humanitarian aid, but if that aid goes to Hamas, it stops. Now, there can be tactical considerations that mean that you don't exactly follow through on that. But the point is, what he's saying is the responsibilities on Hamas. And it was telling that both the EU and the US said that Shifa Hospital was being used by Hamas for military purposes before Israel went in. Okay? So they understand, and Israel has been trying to, as it were, rhetorically arm its allies to help it give it the time that it needs and the legitimacy it needs to win on the battlefield. So that's the first thing that's at stake in this war. The second thing is the regional context. Now, Hamas is ideologically committed to murdering as many Jews as possible. It's in their charter. Yeah? They definitely seek to destroy Israel, but they're true believing anti-Semites wherever you are. But that doesn't help us explain why this has happened now. And the reason that I believe that this has happened now is twofold. Number one, they thought that Israeli society was weak and divided, and that they understand that the military power at their disposal means they don't have enough to defeat Israel militarily. What they hope to do is to demoralize the Israeli public, to make the Israeli public believe that life cannot be lived in Israel in a decent way, to make the Israeli public feel that their army and their state cannot defend them. So it seemed like an opportune moment. And that is why, even when the Israeli security services didn't know what was going to happen in terms of the actions, the military actions, the Minister of Defense came on Israeli television and said, if we continue like we are with these divisions, we are going to face a very serious, immediate threat of war, because this is how our enemies are reading the situation. So that's one element of timing. The second element is that the Abraham Accords, the expanding of Israel's normalization agreements with the Gulf countries and Morocco to Saudi Arabia, appears to be coming closer. Now, this is a very, very serious problem for Iran, for Hezbollah, and Hamas. Why? Because they claim to speak for Islam, and there are 1.8 billion Muslims. Now, if the keeper of the holy places, Saudi Arabia, a very conservative Muslim country, normalizes its relations with Israel, what it means is there is now a competition for what it means to be a good Muslim. And what that would do is it would take away the ability of Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran to define what it means to be a good Muslim, which is to hate Israel, suicide bombings, anti-Western, and it would put forward a different option, which is, let's try and modernize our societies, let's make them, if not free, if not democratic, then at least freer and less authoritarian, okay? And if you're Iran and you're Hezbollah, it's a real problem because you're Shia, and the vast majority, 85% of Muslims, are Sunni, and that's definitely true in the Middle East. Without the common enemy of Israel, it's very hard for Hamas, it's very hard for Hezbollah and Iran to gain support in this region. So that's one element. And you can see that Hamas and Hezbollah feel a certain amount of pressure at this point. What you have here is from 3 years ago, and it's just to do with Hezbollah. And you can see in the vast majority of Arab countries represented here, Hezbollah is extremely unpopular. And if we look in Gaza, right, we can see that Hamas is not particularly popular in Gaza either, right? And that the majority of Gazans wanted to actually maintain the ceasefire with Israel. So there's a sense of stress here, a sense that a moment might have been coming that would have led to a strategic turn. And you can see this here with a sense of if Saudi Arabia normalizes relations with Israel, Palestinian leadership should also normalize relations and end the conflict. Now, you know, this is a very vague question, doesn't mean the Messiah is coming tomorrow or anything like that. But what it shows in Gaza is they're split 50-50, okay? In the West Bank, more opposition. In East Jerusalem, more in favor. The general rule depends on your regime, and that defines the differences here. But I don't want to get into that specifically. I just want to say this is a real issue here, right? This is becoming a live issue. Normalization with Israel is becoming more and more acceptable. And so that poses a threat. And if we look at the attempt to break morale in Israel, we can see that it's failed dramatically. Now, as far as the Jewish population goes, I'd like to go back to what Sarah said. Okay, Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote a very famous book called Democracy in America in about 1834, said that the resilience of democracy in America is to do with the fact that its politics work bottom up. That is, the civil society, churches, trade unions, parent teachers associations, they are active. And that makes it very, very difficult for dictatorships to bring them down. Now, what happened in Israel in the last 6 to 9 months is that hundreds of thousands of Israelis went out to demonstrate every week. And they were organized into different groups. And that made it very, very difficult for anyone to mobilize state power against them, because you're not facing lots of individuals, you're facing intelligent, well-organized, committed civilians, citizens. And what happened in this war with Hamas is that those very same groups have now been mobilized to help Israeli society, to help the Israeli army to deal with this war. So very far from breaking Israeli society has passed this stress test with flying colors. And not only that, one of the aims of Hamas was to bring in other actors, to try and create a multi-front war. One of those fronts was Israel's Arab citizens, of whom there are, depending how you count, between 1.7 and 1.9 million. Look what's happened to their sense of feeling part of Israel and its problems. It's shot up from 48% to 70%. Right? Now, I can't promise you that this number is stable, but I can tell you what it shows is that Hamas has failed in breaking Israeli society apart. Okay, so that's the regional aspect of this, right? Hamas wanted to trigger a regional war. Hezbollah hasn't come in, at least not yet. They failed to mobilize Israeli Arabs, and so far they've failed to bring in West Bank Palestinians. But there's also a global side to this. And what I have here for you is a picture in the middle of Joe Biden juggling. And you have Harry Truman and Henry Kissinger. Why is this strategically important to America? Why is this strategically important to the world? Well, it's important because Joe Biden speaks in terms of the free world. And the free world is a terminology of the Cold War used by Harry Truman and used by Henry Kissinger, Democrats and Republicans. It has not been used by any president since the end of the Cold War until we get to Biden. They have not seen international politics as a battle between the free world and all those who are opposed to the free world. And in this war for the free world, you can't fight everyone, right? This is what Biden is, a child politically of Vietnam. He came into Congress in '72, which is at the peak of the Vietnam War. So he withdrew from Afghanistan. He always favored an early withdrawal from Iraq because that's wasting your resources. You need to know what are the critical nodes for defending the free world. And they are three. Number one, Western Europe, democratic Europe. And that is why the Biden administration was extremely quick to unite NATO behind arming Ukraine, not fighting for Ukraine. The American public won't go for that. And they don't have the resources to fight lots of wars everywhere. But when you have an ally who's willing to do the fighting but needs your help, you help them to constrain Russia which is a threat to the free world. The other threat to the free world is China. And again, here, Biden, one of the first statements he made on becoming president, which is that the US is committed to the defense of Taiwan. And everyone said, oh, he's gone senile. There's no such commitment. America gave up that commitment in 1979. And they're right on paper. But just to make sure the Chinese understood, he said it 4 times in the next year. And he strengthened his alliances, America's alliance, with those countries that have the capability to fight. Japan, Taiwan, Australia, okay? So it's very, very interesting that Israel is a part of this story. And Israel is a part of this story because of oil. What you see here are all the routes that are critical for energy supplies throughout the world. And China and the Far East, so I'll go back here, yeah, get most of their energy supplies from the Middle East. Okay, China is the biggest customer of Iran and Saudi Arabia. So if it's not only that oil matters because of it's in the Middle East, it matters because it can change the balance of power globally. If tomorrow a hostile force got control of the oil in the Middle East, they could use that to pressure America's allies to no longer be its allies, right? And that would shift the whole balance, because if oil doesn't flow to your economy for a period of time, then your economy grinds to a halt. Lots of people become unemployed. There's no electricity. You can't get money out the wall. Law and order breaks down. Politics breaks down. And that's a serious threat to the whole order of your state and more generally. Now, if you're America, what is the best place to prevent this from happening? Well, you can either try and police the whole of the Indian Ocean, right? Here. Or you can look, there are 2 narrow points where if you can control it, you can prevent oil flowing or make sure it flows. One is here, the Persian Gulf, and one is here, the Straits of Malacca in Malaysia. So long as the balance of power in the Middle East is pro-American and America controls this area, that is critical for maintaining support for the free world and the free world's ability to keep going in Europe and in Asia, because the Europeans, in the wake of what's going on in the Ukraine, no longer get their gas from Russia. So this is why Israel is so important to the Americans, because the Saudis and the Gulfies cannot defend these things alone. They are not the Ukraine, they are not Japan, and they are not Australia. And they know it, which is one of the big reasons that they have tried to be closer with Israel, because they recognize that the only country that was willing to use military force to degrade Iran's military capabilities in Syria was Israel. And therefore, the Abraham Accords is not just nice, right? It's important for America because it strengthens their whole global position, and it helps the free world globally, not just locally. And if you're Russia, you're on Hamas's side, because if the oil doesn't get through, you are a lot more powerful and you're a lot richer because the price of oil goes shooting up. If you're China, you don't know what to do because you get your oil from both sides. And that's why the Chinese have been very, very quiet. And in a certain way, if China was to join the American line on this, which is unlikely but not impossible, that would mean Iran would be in very, very serious trouble. Certainly, the Chinese, like the Americans, don't want a regional escalation, because what everybody fears, if there's a regional escalation and war starts breaking out all over the Middle East. So here you can see where all America's bases are, right? And where their troops are. So we know that they're already being attacked in all these places by Iran, but it's still, and their proxies, but it's still low level. If that was to become regional, right? If that was, if what happens with Hezbollah was to escalate and then Iran came in and then the Americans came in, that could lead to a conflict which could block the Persian Gulf, and then oil wouldn't flow to anyone, and that would be very bad for China as much as America. So they don't have an interest in it escalating either. Okay, the final thing I want to talk about is why is it that there are hundreds of thousands of people in Britain and in other places who support Hamas? Now, if you're an Islamic extremist, I don't need to explain it to you, but you will have noticed that there's a lot of white faces who, by any estimation, are not supporters of Hamas in the sense that they're Islamic fundamentalists. Now, many people who are sitting at home and sympathizing with children in Gaza, you know, have not necessarily have an animus of anti-Semitism towards Israel. They just don't understand what's going on and they're not that involved. But the people who are going out marching are very aware with what's going on because they're motivated, they're organizing. So what is it that makes them do what they do? Why is it that human rights organizations do not recognize human rights abuses against Israel? Why do they wipe them out? So what we have to understand here are two things. What's the difference between a liberal and a leftist? And where does leftist anti-Semitism come from? Well, what you see here is a picture that's of an octopus, which is from Soviet propaganda, and a picture more recently of from a far left website of Israel as being, and the Rothschilds as being somehow behind all the conflicts in the world. The idea of a Jewish financial conspiracy controlling the world that is innately capitalistic, and capitalism is the enemy of the radical left, right? You need a revolution against it, has a long history of 150 years. It's pretty much been there since the beginning of the communist or radical socialist groups. So they associate Jews with the ruling class. But what's all that got to do with human rights? So here I have for you two quotes, which I hope will explain it. When we think of human rights, we think as small L liberals. We think every individual human being is of equal and unmeasurable value, right? Unique. And we think that the way that we judge whether a person is a good person or a bad person is by what ideas they express and what behaviors they as individuals undertake. Not so the radical left. Here's Joseph Harker, the assistant editor of The Guardian from 2002. As a black man, I'm bound to suffer prejudices of my own. But I cannot be racist, however, because in the global order, I do not belong to the dominant group. In other words, it's nothing. I can say the most terrible things. I can do the most terrible things, but I'm not a racist because in post-colonial leftism, in woke leftism, instead of there being a bourgeoisie that is wrong because it belongs to a certain group, and there's a proletariat that is right, whatever, because it belongs to a certain group. Instead of classes, we have races. And dark-skinned people are automatically right, whatever behavior and whatever ideas they express, because in this conception, they are the victims of capitalism. And capitalism is white. So Israel is white in inverted commas. Israel is strong in inverted commas. Israel is wrong. And here's John Molyneux from the Socialist Workers' Party journal International Socialism applying this idea to our conflict. And this is from 2003-4. It's not from this conflict. From the standpoint of Marxism and international socialism, an illiterate, conservative, superstitious Muslim Palestinian peasant who supports Hamas is more progressive than an educated, liberal, atheist Israeli who supports Zionism even critically. And what we see the strategy of this group is they know that if this is what they actually said, they would have very few supporters. So they use liberal language and they try and capture human rights organizations. And they hide their real ideas by blurring the distinction that I made between a small L liberal conception of human rights and a far left radical view. And it got to the point a few years ago when the founder of Human Rights, which was Human Rights Watch, which is one of the first two major human rights organizations in the world, along with Amnesty International, its founder wrote an op-ed in the New York Times disowning his own organization precisely because this is what had happened. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Reinold. Before answering your questions, I would like to thank all our panelists for their participation today. And we have like a few questions. I'll start with two to Professor Friedman. The first one is, I'll just read it. Did the COVID pandemic lay a backdrop of trauma that makes the war-induced PTSD worse?
It's a great question. I don't know what the answer is. I suspect that for children, especially young children under the age of 10, it will have a very big impact because their schooling has been so interrupted. So I suspect for them that we will see that that there's a connection. I'm not sure that that's true for other people and for adults. Netta, you're on mute.
We have another question for you. Is PTSD treated by EMDR? And if yes, how successful the therapy is in your practice?
Okay, so in general in Israel, yes, the answer is yes. At the moment, there's definitely a lot of early EMDR work being done. As to how what impact it's having, I don't think anybody can give an answer on that. It's definitely something that, because it's an evidence-based treatment, that we're recommending for once we get to the post-trauma bit, will be one of the interventions that could be used.
Thank you. Okay, you hear me? A question for Professor Halperin Kadari. How do you move forward from here regarding the global women's rights groups and the rest of the world when it comes to acknowledgement of gender-based violence and what happened on October 7th? And what is still happening with the hostages? Is there a legal way to get them to accept and understand what has happened? How do we reach them and expose their double standards legally on an international scale?
Thank you for this question, because this is really an opportunity to address all of you, as I hinted at the end of my presentation. We are now talking about global war over the narrative and over the memory, over the acknowledgement, over the historical justice, over the truth. And we just heard Jonathan's illuminating explanation of the undertones, what really is behind or underneath this silence and what I call betrayal. But I do believe that this is it can be changed, and it must be changed. And what many of us are engaged in now is an ongoing campaign in response to that campaign of denial and of silence. And I think I can very, very carefully say that I do sense some change within global media. And I refer now to the conventional media, right? To the leading newspaper, TV channels. I'm not talking about social media. And I know that it's very dangerous to take this position, because I'm also aware of the New York Times poll of last week, I think, which shockingly found out that amongst the younger Americans, those between 18 and 24, who actually get their information from social media, from TikTok and from Instagram, a third really believe that everything that we say, everything that we talked about in this, what Alon described, what I described, is completely fake. October 7th never happened. So a third of the younger Americans believe that. I leave that aside, and I'm saying that the more conventional media channels are writing more and more about what I talked about the sexual violence against women, and going back to the descriptions of the massacre. And this is extremely important, and to keep talking, obviously, about the hostages, all those demonstrations, the flyers with the pictures of the children and the babies and the men and women. They must remain in the public consciousness, in the public awareness. And each and every one of you can approach your representatives, whether you're in America, your congressperson, your senators, whether you are in Europe, must get more countries to declare Hamas a terrorist organization with all its ramifications. Each one of us can be an active actor in the battle over public opinion and public awareness and just historic justice.
Thank you. Another question to Professor Friedman. Another aspect of collective trauma is that the people who weren't directly involved, even if they know people who were, may also be suffering from trauma, as you mentioned, but may feel guilty about asking for psychological help because the country's support system may be overstretched and need to focus on those who were directly involved. What do you say to people like that who may want to suffer in silence because they feel their trauma is not even close to those who were there?
It's an excellent question. I think that this is true for everybody, whether they were directly or feel it was direct or indirect. I don't think there's anybody who hasn't been directly affected. It doesn't really seem to matter. People with PTSD find it very difficult to come for therapy. It's part of being avoidant. It's very hard to convince people to come anyhow. One of the things that we're talking about is how to do outreach and identify people in a way that will facilitate this, from educating family doctors and teachers in schools and pretty much everybody, so that we can actually manage to do that. And at the same time, to try and increase that capacity so that there won't be people who are left behind, even if they feel uncomfortable about using the system.
You have one question for Professor Reinold. Okay. Some experts also argue that one of the reasons that America doesn't want the escalation of regional wars because they don't have enough military resource in dealing with two regional wars at the same time. Let alone China also pose great military threat in the Indo-Pacific region. And more American officers believe that Indo-Pacific region and Europe are far more important than Middle East region. What is your viewpoint regarding this issue?
You're on mute.
Thank you, Ruth. There is certainly an issue of supply. It's the Americans are they're already supplying the Ukrainians, and they have to be on guard vis-a-vis China, and they had assumed that the situation in the Middle East was sort of less urgent. And part of the reason for the sort of placating of Iran is so that they don't have too full a plate. But these are three critical regions. So now the order of priority has changed, and they've sent 2 aircraft carriers. Now that's never happened before. That doubles the size of the aeroplanes that in effect are at Israel's disposal. They're there to deter conflict. But the only way that you can deter conflict is by making the other side believe that you'll use your forces if you have to. And that's why the president himself said American fighter planes have attacked Iranian bases in Syria and killed people there, right? They're trying to say, don't, as the president said 15 times, right? Which means that if it comes to it, the Americans have enough force at their disposal to do a hell of a lot of things. They would rather not fight a regional war in the Middle East while the Ukraine's going on. They would worry that the Chinese would try and take advantage of it, of course. But if the other side, which I don't think they will, but if they were to sort of test the Americans out, I personally think the Americans would show them that actually they are prepared to act. And there was an American senator who, well-known friend of Israel on the Republican side, who said, we could always bomb Iran's oil fields. Now, the administration didn't say that, but I'm sure it made people in China and in Iran think, right? Because they could easily do that. And those type of things are available. Now, on the other part of it, about, the Far East and Europe is more important. Well, the problem for America is that the Middle East is potentially critical to your ability to deal with the Far East and Europe. I mean, the world economy will run on oil and gas for at least another 25 years, if not longer, according to all the assessments I've seen. But obviously, I'm not a prophet, right? So we have to assume that that is probably the way things are going to be. And therefore, control over the Persian Gulf, this very, very small area, right, is critical. And it's very noticeable that whereas Obama spoke about a pivot to Asia, since then, and this is the one thing that Democrats and Republicans agree on, right? The containment of China is consensus in American politics and foreign policy. And both the Biden administration and the Trump administration have been trying hard to regain America's position in the Middle East with a view to pushing the Chinese out. So Israel, they're putting a lot of pressure on Israel. Who do we allow to build our metro system? Who do we allow to build our ports? Who do we sell our insurance companies to? And they're doing the same in Asia. Why do you think they're thinking about an alliance with Saudi Arabia, which is the last thing they want? Because they don't want them to go off to the Chinese, right? So this is all connected. This is all connected. Now, it may well be that there are lots of people in Washington who don't understand that it's all connected. I think that's true. But we're lucky that this administration does understand. And part of the reason that this is also important to them is because they cannot fight on their own 3 different places all on their own at the same time. It's not possible, right? They need allies, okay? And we're very important to their allies in the Middle East. We are now integrated into what's called CENTCOM, which is their regional command. We sit in the same room with the Emiratis and the Saudis and all the rest of them, coordinating our strategy. And for the Gulf countries and for Egypt, Israel's presence is critical to the credibility of America as an ally. America's credibility as an ally in the Arab world since 2011 has gone right down. So from a big picture for America, the Middle East, in my opinion, remains critical. But there are wings of the Democratic Party to the left and wings of the Republican Party to the right, the farthest wings of them, who don't agree. And that's a potentially serious challenge, not only for Israel, but for anyone who cares about at least protecting what freedom and democracy exists in the world.
Thank you, Professor Reinhold. So we have just one last question for Alon, Dr. Barash, sorry. I know it's going to take a long time to identify many of the bodies that haven't been identified yet, but with such limited resources, what can be done to speed up the process, have international forensic archaeologists and pathologists and others come to Israel to help? Is there any point in bringing them here? Will they be able to help?
So let me just tell you that there are still bodies being recovered from, especially from around the kibbutzim and from where the party was. And I'm right now at a point that I'm part of a WhatsApp group that are getting dozens of pictures a day to try to differentiate between animal bones and human bones. And this is the 5th week this is going on. It's really terrible. And I think that we are at a point that we don't really need the help of more anthropologists, but specialists in forensic medicine who know how to conduct a forensic scene research. The point being that I need to know who was where at what point of time. So trying to get the bodies and the people from one side and the investigation of who was supposed to be where on the other side, trying to combine them together. So if I know that in a certain kibbutz somebody was in a certain house, I don't have to identify a certain skeleton from everyone in Israel, but from that kibbutz, from that room. That takes a lot of expertise and a lot of research into knowing who was where. Takes a lot of time. And the problem is that we need somebody who knows Israel, who knows, children moved from house to house, for example. In one of the kibbutzim, it was the kibbutz birthday. So there were a lot of guests. Somebody need to take that into order and try to help with that. We are going with that. We're trying to do that. It's a long process. And the worst of it is that I imagine that for years to come, people will find human remains in these places. And that's a real tragedy. And I also suspect that we will narrow down the number of missing persons, but we will never get it to zero. There's a lot of, we had a lot of, aside from Israeli, there's a lot of foreign nationalities, a lot of people from Thailand. And that is a big issue that we're trying now to sort of decipher. I don't know, but if we'll ever get the number to zero, unfortunately.